schedule, which for a Jewish organization is about 10 minutes before this supposed beginning time. But we need every minute because we have a very special speaker, lecturer, and many are here tonight because of this special lecturer. As I mentioned before, he's not only an orator of note, but a superior Talmud Chacham, Torah scholar, and he has an encyclopedic knowledge of so many of the sciences, history, language, and he has tremendous wit as well. I had the good fortune of hearing Rabbi Mordechai Becher speak a number of times, and I knew right away we have to ask Rabbi Becher to speak. He has spoken for us a few times, and we're so delighted that he agreed to speak tonight as well. Topic is anti-Semitism, and if you want to hear, we will hear tonight using all of his scholarship, pulling the subject matter together. This is not a secular approach. This is an approach which is with Torah, with history, with psychology, and we can all benefit from hearing Rabbi Becher. I'd like to mention that this Yeshivalite is dedicated to the memory of Mr. Herman Leifer, father of a very dear friend of the center, one of our board members, Mr. Kevin Leifer, and Mrs. Erica Leifer is here as well. We're honored by their presence. Even though we mention it each time, and I don't know why the rabbi is sitting in the back, I guess because he has to leave perhaps a little bit early, but Rabbi Gideon Shlush is such a magnificent partner to work with in terms of Jewish programming that we are exceptionally grateful to Rabbi Shlush and the synagogue membership for partnering with us or allowing us to partner with them in these programs. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's what I meant. It's delicious partnering with you. Okay, without further ado, please give Rabbi Mordechai Becher your full attention.
I much prefer an understated introduction, which is easier to live up to.
Than one which
engages in massive hyperbole. But okay. Although after an introduction like that, I actually can hardly wait to hear myself speak. So there is some advantage to that. So talking about anti-Semitism, there's a bit of a danger, and the danger is that, as some historians put it, we end up having this lachrymose history of the Jewish people, a tear-filled history that sounds like Jewish history is basically us schlepping from one pogrom to the next. And it's not really like that. There were ups and downs. There were times that we lived quite well. We prospered. We had various golden ages. There are times that we lived, yes, under oppressive regimes, but we actually had a decent life. So it's important that even though the subject is anti-Semitism, so we're going to be focused on the oy vey history as opposed to the oh wow history, but nevertheless we should be aware that it's not all oy vey. It's a very, very and wonderful history of the Jewish people. Let me first of all begin with a little bit of an overview. The overview of anti-Semitism, predicted by the Torah, as you see in the first in the very first source, you shall become an object of horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the peoples where the Lord will lead you. Indeed, right? I played for my students at Yeshiva University today a clip from the famous Tom Lehrer, right? National Brotherhood Week, right? It's well worth seeing if you can. And it's phenomenal, where he has this song about the Catholics hate the Protestants and the whites hate the blacks and the blacks hate the whites, and one of the refrains is, and everyone hates the Jews, right? It's reminded Woody Allen was sent by his parents, he said, to interfaith camp during the summer. He says there he was beaten equally by people of all races and creeds. He may have deserved it, but nevertheless, right? But there is certainly, if we look at a review of much of Jewish history, we've had people literally trying to destroy us at many, many times in our history, and people from many different persuasions and different theologies and different philosophies. We go back. The ancient Egyptians, you could say that wasn't anti-Semitism. They were just in general into slavery. You know, so the Jews were targets of opportunity. I don't know, possible, right? You've got, though, when we came out of Egypt, of course, we were attacked by a nation called Amalek, and Amalek is considered to be the prototype of the anti-Semite. Amalekites, Rav Yitzchak Hutner points out in one of his essays that Amalek, their philosophy was Amalek over everything. That there were no such thing as absolute morals. There was only one moral ideal, which is Amalek. You know, very similar to something which we're probably all familiar with, Deutschland über alles. So that philosophy was the philosophy of Amalek that sought to attack and destroy the Jewish people at the very, very beginning. We hadn't come close to their country. We had no plans to come close to their country, and nevertheless they attacked us. And it continued throughout history in different times and locations. Of course, we know that the Babylonians destroyed the temple. I don't know if that was anti-Semitism. That was more like politics and economics, and the Jews were exiled to Babylon. We actually lived pretty well in Babylon. We lived so well in Babylon that when the king Darius gave permission for the Jews to return to Israel, most of the Jews did not return. Some returned. The people who did return were all the outcasts, the outliers in society. Not outliers in a positive sense, like Malcolm Gladwell outliers, but outliers in a negative sense, like they're counting tonight in New York, right? And they came back to Israel, but the Jews lived in Babylon, and we were okay for a long time. We had the Romans. Later on in history, the Assyrians. Again, Assyrian policy was to assimilate all peoples. They just wasn't specifically attacking the Jews. They were like the Borg of the ancient world. Those Hamavin, Yavin, right? One of the we will assimilate you. Resistance is futile. Star Trek, etc. Anyway, so but then from that time on, we started getting some genuine anti-Semitism. Now Rome did destroy the temple, but in all fairness, we did revolt 3 times against Roman rule. This was unusual. It prompted Presenius Niger, I think it was, to call us the most revolting of people. So, but we did revolt against the Romans a number of times, and they cracked down very hard on the Jewish people and exiled us all over the world. And that was the beginning of the diaspora. And the diaspora is really where we experienced most of our most anti-Semitism. The Romans, with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, 70 of the Common Era, exiled the Jews. First of all, a lot of Jews went as prisoners of war, a lot of Jews went as slaves, a lot of Jews went because there was no real possibility of survival in the land of Israel. It had been deforested, it had been the economy, infrastructure, and everything else had been destroyed by the Romans, so Jews went where the Roman Empire went. We went to Gaul and Sparta, to Gaul and England and France and Germany and Italy and so on and so forth, and we literally were spread over throughout the world. And that's really when much of our experience of hatred began. We were in most places not counted as a nation. If you look in the second source, here is a people living alone, not reckoning itself amongst nations. Am levadad yishkon, ubagoyim lo yitchashav. A nation that dwells alone, not considered amongst the nations. There's a wonderful book by Yehuda Avner, who was an advisor to a number of prime ministers of Israel. The book is called The Prime Ministers. Phenomenal book, highly recommend it. And Yehuda Avner describes how Menachem Begin used to have a Parsha study group in the Prime Minister's office. That was something started by Ben Gurion, although it was not religious, but he had a Bible study group in the Prime Minister's office every week with Torah scholars and professors and archaeologists. It was a fascinating group. And Menachem Begin continued that. And Netanyahu had a similar thing at some point. So Menachem Begin, it was the Parsha, which this is the week that this verse appears. And he describes the Parsha study group in Menachem Begin's office, where they're discussing this verse, that we are a nation that dwells alone. And Menachem Begin was sitting there listening. There were some scholars and archaeologists. One said it's really one of the rabbis said it's a precept. It's a prescriptive. It's not descriptive, it's prescriptive. It says we are supposed to dwell alone. We're not supposed to assimilate. And another one said we're a nation that dwells alone because we didn't have a country for so many years, and hence we didn't really fit in anywhere, etc. And Menachem Begin had just come back from the United Nations. And he said, when we are described as a nation that dwells alone, not considered amongst the nations, he says, I felt it at the United Nations. There was a depth of hatred for the state of Israel, he says, which is incomprehensible. He says, we were not at that time, we were not part of any regional group. You've got to be a regional group to sit on the Security Council of the United Nations. You've got to be part of a regional group. But no regional group wanted us. Obviously, the Middle Eastern regional group, all the Arab countries said, no, Israel doesn't exist, right? Or it shouldn't exist, or etc. So not part of our group. Europe said, no, right? Not part of our group. So Africa, definitely not. So we were not part of any group. So we dwelt alone. And that continued throughout a lot of our history. In the Roman government was not always anti-Semitic, but we're actually considered a legitimate religion under Roman law. We could practice Judaism. But later in history, under Constantine, the Roman Empire becomes Christian. That's when the anti-Semitism really started to increase. You started to get people like Bishop Ambrose of Milan advocating burning down synagogues, St. John Chrysostom talking about synagogues as dens of thieves and prostitutes, and we started getting the theological anti-Semitism, seeing Jews as killers of Jesus, deicide the killing murder of God, causing him to suffer, and that was something which we were never forgiven for. And certainly that was a major part of Christian anti-Semitism. It took on various forms at different times in history. We of course had infamous blood libels. The last one, which was actually in the United States, in Atlanta, Georgia. But blood libels in which Jews were accused of killing Christians and taking their blood. A reenactment of the crucifixion. Eventually what was added to that were other, and sometimes anti-Semitism was so bizarre and irrational, it was believed by many medieval Christians, even scholars, that Jews needed Christian blood because Jewish men menstruated and hence needed the blood to cure them of that. There were some who believed that Jews had a stench, there was a Jewish stench, we needed Christian blood to cure us of the Jewish stench. There were some, then eventually they developed a theory that we used the blood for matzah. That's probably you've probably heard that before. And that was pervasive. That was believed by people believed that. People believed that Jews did that. My mother, Aleha Hashalom, I'm saying Kaddish for her this year. My mother, Aleha Hashalom, grew up in England before the Second World War. And she was from a family, it was a fairly assimilated family. Most of her friends were not Jewish. But around, just before Pesach time, the parents of her non-Jewish friends wouldn't let them play at my grandmother's house. England in the 1930s. They were not allowed to play at my mother's home because it was near Pesach and they're Christian children, so you've got to be careful. Who knows what my mother would have done? Unbelievable. Right? There were some really bizarre. There was what's called the torturing of the host libel. That's not staying too long for lunch. What that means is we are indeed guilty of that. But torturing the host refers to the Christian belief known as transubstantiation, Catholic belief, where the wafer they have in church becomes the body of Jesus and the wine becomes his blood, and they eat it during the Eucharist. So it was commonly believed, and Jews were accused of this often, of stealing or obtaining the host, the wafer, and then torturing it, to basically reenact the torture and suffering of Jesus. So Jews would steal a wafer and boil it in oil or stab it with pins, and Christian witnesses would come forth and talk about how they heard Jesus, the baby Jesus, crying when he was stabbed, the wafer, which actually they're going to chew, eat and digest after, but let's leave that aside. And I know it sounds bizarre, but there were Jewish communities that were massacred as a result of this libel. Thousands of Jews, or at least certainly hundreds, possibly thousands of Jews killed as a result of this libel that we would torture a cookie. It's inconceivable nowadays, but this was believed. This was believed not by fools. This was believed by many Christians, and many of them were fairly well educated. I don't think Christians believe in that nowadays. Highly unlikely, but I mean, it's Ted Nugent maybe, but I mean, I don't think your average Christian believes in today. Certainly does not believe in that type of libel. Certainly, the Catholic Church officially has repudiated the blood libel and the libel many times. Popes publicly wrote against it, that it was not true, it did not exist, and still it persisted amongst the population. Interesting. And of course, so that was from the Christian side, and that manifested itself in its most extreme ways in various, like for example 1391 in Spain, with the massive riots against the Jews of Spain, who thousands converted to Christianity as a result of that, which started the whole crypto-Jewish history, the Jews who were secret Jews, and followed by the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and then the expulsion from Portugal, the conversion in 1497, and of course even before then you had the Crusades, 1096, the First Crusade, which although ostensibly its purpose was to rid the Holy Land of the infidel Muslims, but as is attributed to one of the leaders of the First Crusade, he said, "We are going to the Holy Land to rid it of infidels. What about those who live amongst us?" And so we know that in the period between Pesach and Shavuot, in the year 1096, of the 30,000 Jews living in that area, in the Rhineland, Speyer, Mayence, Worms, of those 30,000 Jews, 5,000 died in the First Crusade. 5,000 out of 30,000. So that's horrifying, and in very cruel ways. So, and Christian anti-Semitism continued throughout history, and it had its ups and downs. There were times when it was less, times when it was more, and it manifests itself not just amongst the Catholics. Martin Luther, founder of the Protestant Church, was a rabid anti-Semite. One of his books is called On the Jews and Their Lies, in which he accuses the Jews of living from the excrement of the devil and being his spawn, and worse. Advocate, and virtually everything the Nazis did is actually there in his book, advocated to do to the Jews. So Martin Luther. We have the Russian Orthodox Church, Khmelnytsky pogroms, horrifying pogroms. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack leader and still considered a hero by many, massacred thousands of Jews in the most horrific ways, which I cannot describe. And that continued. And of course we know of the very sorry and tragic history of the church in relationship to Nazism and the Second World War, especially the Catholic Church in Germany, very shameful episode. And so that's as far as Christianity. We got also from even today, by the way, the Methodist Church in the United States has voted for BDS, the boycotting, divestment and sanctioning of Israel. Thousands of Christians being massacred in Syria, Christians being persecuted in every single Arab country, not being allowed free practice of religion, not being allowed to build churches, not being allowed to enter churches. The only country in the Middle East in which Christians have complete freedom of worship is Israel. The only country in the Middle East in which churches are renovated, cared for by government funding, and supplied with what they need is Israel. The only country in the Middle East where someone, if they want, could convert to Christianity is Israel. And yet, the one country which the Methodist Church has chosen to boycott, divest, and sanction is Israel. Amazing. Amazing. Okay. So it hasn't ended. And I should point out, not all Christians are anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, God forbid. I mean, there's the CUFI, the Christians United for Israel, which is a wonderful organisation. I attended their conference in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago, one of the most inspiring events of my life. I remember the church choir from Pastor Hagee's church singing in excellent Hebrew, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav and Hatikva, with 5,000 Christians in the room singing with them, waving Israeli flags and crying. I think the only people not crying were the 10 rabbis in the room. It was like unbelievable, right? So it was incredible. But now we have the Muslims. So it is true that Jews were able to live under Islam generally much better than under the Christians. We have the status, however, of Dhimma, or Dhimmi, which means a protected minority. Jews, as part of the Al-Kitab, the people of the book, had a status that we were allowed to practice Judaism, but, and this is an important caveat, we had to be second-class citizens. That means, how was that expressed? The universal expression of that was jizya, a special tax that Jews had to pay to show their subservience to Islam. That was something which we had to pay throughout history. That's the only aspect of Dhimma, of that status, which was universal, for two reasons. A, it's explicit in the Quran, you had it on the sources here, and B, it's financial, so there's some income from that. But nevertheless, Jews were treated in various ways by the Muslims, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but always with a sense of subservience to the Muslims. Whether it was the Sunnis or the Shiites, in Shiite countries like Iran, Jews were considered to be impure. There were places in Iran which up until the 20th century including, there were places where the Jews were not allowed to go outside during the rain, lest a drop of rain splashed from the Jew onto the Muslim. And the law on the books, still on the books in Iran today, if a Jew dies, if any one of his children or her children convert to Islam, they get the entire inheritance, the rest get nothing. Okay, that's a little incentive to convert. So this was the type of thing that Jews confronted in Yemen up until the 20th century. If a Jewish parent died, the children would be taken and raised as Muslims, because Islam is the natural religion of mankind. The parents perverted the child, so once the parent dies, we should raise the child as his natural or her natural religion, which is Islam. And there were blood libels in the Muslim world, which actually are on the increase today. One of the most infamous ones was Sulha Arafat, Yasser Arafat's wife, who accused the Jews of poisoning the Arab water supply and causing cancer amongst Palestinians and infecting them with AIDS. I think Hillary Clinton was at the event when she said that. So that's a classic blood libel type thing. Jewish conspiracy theory, we can believe anything about the Jews. There is a libel that is rampant in the Arab world that the IDF harvests organs from Palestinians that they kill. They harvest organs. That's classic blood libel type stuff. And the type of things people believe about what the Israeli army does, when statistically the ratio of non-combatant deaths to combatant deaths is the lowest of any army in modern times, and the rules of engagement in the Israeli army are very, very strict in terms of combatants and non-combatants. I know this. A, I was in the Israeli army. B, I have two sons who are in combat units in the Israeli army, it's on the level of blood libels. So we have that from Islam, and of course, as you know, Muslim countries have been trying to destroy Israel from its very inception. And as you know, Hamas, which is described in the American media, world media, as a militant group, in the Hamas charter, you see on the outline here, they quote from a hadith. Hadith is the Islamic oral tradition. So there's the Quran, which is the written law, and there's Hadith, which is the oral tradition, which also got written down eventually. So in a famous Hadith, the Hadith says that the war against the Jews will not be over until the very rocks and trees shout, "O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." That particular Hadith is quoted in the Hamas charter. Hamas quotes that in the preamble to their charter. And of course, the Palestinian Authority, who are supposed to be our partners in peace, in their charter, which has not been amended, say that the Jews' claims of historic or religious ties of the Jews with Palestine are incompatible with the facts of history. The Jews are not a nation. They are the citizens of the country in which they live. So we are basically demoted from nationhood. We're not a nation, and our connections to Israel are, according to them, fictional. Absolute fiction. So there's anti-Semitism from the Muslims. We have anti-Semitism from the extreme left. We know that, that certainly left-wing governments in Europe, liberal governments in Europe are, I mean, people will say it's anti-Israel, but it's really anti-Semitism. And it's thinly disguised as anti-Zionism. The BDS movement, which is being led by a lot of... And again, there are plenty of left-wing liberals and there are plenty of atheists who are pro-Israel. Wonderful, fantastic. Not all, right, are anti-Israel, but the BDS movement is being led by, and as Alan Dershowitz has pointed out in an excellent piece, he says, if you are practicing boycott, divestment, and sanctions against all countries that practice massive human rights violations, that have censorship of the media, that have imprisonment without trial, that do not have freedom of speech and so on, and freedom of religion, then you should do that. But and if you want to include Israel in that incorrectly, go ahead. But if the only country you are singling out for sanctions, the only country in the world that you are singling out for boycott, the only country in the world that you are singling out for divestment is Israel, that we have to question that might be anti-Semitism. Okay, so that's the phenomenon. And of course, in our last century, we experienced probably the worst ever. We just observed Holocaust Memorial Day, and of course the Holocaust was just horrific, and it should be understood that it was not something carried out only by Germans of the Nazi Party. It was enthusiastically aided and abetted by populations in Latvia, in Slovakia, in Belarus, in Lithuania, in the Ukraine, in Poland. Enthusiastic participation in the Holocaust by ordinary citizens in these countries resulted in as we know, the massacre, the slaughter of 6 million Jews in an unprecedented war against civilians. I just read an Austrian newspaper today petitioned the court in Austria to call Mauthausen, which was a concentration camp in Austria, to call the inmates criminals. That's the Jews who were imprisoned because they were Jewish. Criminals. So it's a right-wing newspaper in Austria is calling them criminals. Okay. So that's a brief history. So if that's not lachrymose, I don't know what is. But what we see from this is a few things. A, anti-Semitism has come both from the right wing and the left. Fascists, communists. It has come from monotheists and it's come from pagans. It has come from Christians and Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, Methodists, Shiites, Sunnis. So that's a strange thing. That's very strange. So an explanation has to, we have to find some explanation which will understand that it comes from many different directions and in situations where Jews were wealthy. Of course, then we are accused of controlling the newspapers, controlling the banks, controlling world politics, etc. Which, I think at the last meeting, the elders of Zion, I think we decided not to control the media anymore. Isn't that correct? So anyway, I don't know if you have the protocols, Akiva? I don't remember. Okay. Anyway, but we've been accused of controlling all that type of stuff. And when we're poor, so we're accused of being parasites. And among capitalists, we're accused of being socialists. Among socialists, we're accused of being capitalists. And, you know, so it's a little bit strange. It's a little bit of a strange phenomenon. And people there have been historians who've attempted to explain it as the scapegoat explanation, which is the Jews, every society needs a scapegoat. You need to blame someone to avoid the spotlight being focused on the failings of the government or of the leadership. But then it's always the same scapegoat. Like you can't choose someone else. It's always the same scapegoat. That's a little strange. There are some people who've said it's like a psychological aberration. It's almost like a sickness. But that's strange. When you have a sickness that encompasses such a vast variety of people, such a diverse group of religions, you've got to ask yourself, right, are they all, right, is it that everyone has, if everyone has some type of mental disability, it's no longer, it's no longer an aberration, it's, right? There are some who've said it's for economic reasons. Economics. Jews were money lenders. For instance, in England, before the expulsion in 1290, Jews were money lenders in Europe, medieval times. But of course, that's putting the cart before the horse, right? Because one of the reasons Jews were money lenders in many places because we weren't allowed to join the trade guilds, because they wouldn't let Jews in. We weren't allowed to treat non-Jewish patients as doctors in a lot of places. We were only allowed to live in the ghetto, and we were only allowed to engage in certain trades. So really, what caused us to be money lenders? Anti-Semitism. Wasn't anti-Semitism cause money? Money lending didn't cause anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism caused the money lending. Right? We engaged in banking and international trade. One of the reasons was we were mobile. We had to do things which we could be mobile in. Why? Because we could get kicked out of countries frequently, and we did. So it wasn't that caused the anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism that caused that. It's an effect, not a cause. And so there are all types of explanations. If you look, it's interesting to note, Rashi seems to tell us that it's ideological. The motivation is always ideological. He says there's a few sources that indicate this. He says they're opposed to our God, or the Gemara, there's the Talmud, which says that Mount Sinai, Har Sinai, bears a phonological relationship to the word sinah. The pronunciation is the same. There's different letters, a samach instead of a sin. But the Gemara says it's called Sinai because from there hatred came down to the world. Interesting, the Gemara seems to be blaming anti-Semitism on our laws, our philosophy. The Torah, almost. What's the meaning of that? It's a very strange thing. So one explanation that the Maharal gives is that that people always hate those who are separate and different. And Jews indeed have been separate and different. That is accurate. We have been separate and different throughout history. In the Scroll of Esther, we'll be reading in a month and a half from tonight. So the Scroll of Esther, Haman accuses the Jews. He tells King Ahasuerus, Datehem shonot mikol am. Their religion is different from every people. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked a fantastic question. He says, hold on. Ahasuerus rules 120 countries from India to Ethiopia. What, the Jews are the only people who are different? Everyone else are wasps? India to Ethiopia, 120 provinces, Persian Empire. Haman says, look, the Jews, they're different. Well, who isn't? So one comedian said, yeah, but we're more different than everyone. Right, okay, maybe. Right, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, he says, part of Judaism is to be different. That's what he was saying. Other people are different just because they happen to have, that happens to be their ethnicity. But Jews have to be different. It's interesting. Wagner pointed it out. Wagner said, the Jew, who as everyone knows has a God all to himself, no matter to what European nationality we belong, has something disagreeably foreign to that nationality. We have our own calendar. We have our own ebb and flow of the Jewish year is not controlled by Walmart or Hallmark, right? It is controlled by a divine calendar, right? The ebb and flow of Jewish life is very different. We have our own festivals, we have our own synagogues, we have our own writing, etc., etc. So just the fact that we're different sometimes, that does exacerbate hatred. I don't think it explains things like the Holocaust, Crusades. That's a lot worse. I think that's more ideological opposition. And it's interesting, why is there ideological opposition to the Jews? So we understand Christianity and Islam, I can understand the ideological opposition. In Christianity, as one of my students put it, when I was talking about something called replacement theology. Replacement theology is the belief that Christianity replaced Judaism. 12 apostles replaced the 12 tribes, the church replaced the synagogue, the New Testament replaced the Old, and so on and so forth. So one of my students put it very eloquently in his American way, and he said, so like we're frozen, they're chosen? And if we're chosen, they're frozen. I said, that is correct, yes. That's well put. Right? Because you see, if the Jews are vigorous, alive and kicking, speaking Hebrew, reading the Torah, keeping Shabbat, putting on tefillin, etc., etc., that's problematic for them. Why is that problematic? Because we're supposed to be fossils. We was fossilized about 2,000 years ago. Right? So why, if you walk on the beach in Costa Rica and you see a three-pronged footprint of a velociraptor, right, you should be scared. But if you're walking in Beit Zayed near Har Nof in Jerusalem and you see fossilized dinosaur footprints on a piece of stone which were fossilized about 100 million years ago or so, right, no reason to be scared. But what if the fossil comes to life? Right? So Jews are really with the Jurassic Park of history, so to speak, right? We as, so to speak, we should be fossils. We should be fossils. From the Christian perspective, the Messiah already came. He made Judaism obsolete. And yet, the Jews who invented the Messiah, who were waiting for the Messiah himself was Jewish, he spoke Hebrew, he was one of the Jewish people, and yet the Jews rejected him and continued to do so. That's a slap in the face. And it's more than a slap in the face. It's almost like we are living evidence against that, against their philosophy. So they've got to make sure either that some said that we don't exist, or as Augustine of Hippo said, the Jews should be not killed, they should remain alive, oppressed as witnesses to the church's ascendancy. So that's how it has to be. So don't kill them, but keep them under your thumb, right? Make sure that they are never raising their heads in any way, because otherwise we're a contradiction. And in Islam, it's very similar, because they have a belief called naskh in Arabic, which means abrogation. According to this idea, Jesus came and abrogated the Torah, and then Muhammad came and abrogated Jesus and Christianity. And now Muhammad, the seal of prophets, has replaced and has made obsolete everything beforehand. And and he appealed to the Jews, and he's a monotheist, they're total monotheists. If so, why are the Jews rejecting this final seal of the prophets, who's a continuation of the Old Testament prophets? How could it be? So we also present a bit of a problem for the Muslims. But part of the problem is, and here is really, I think, the essence of the issue, not just for Christians, not just for Muslims, but also for certain atheists. What's the problem? The problem is that according to all of their philosophies, what should the Jews look like? Fossils. But what happened was, in the 19th century, Jews started returning to the land of Israel. And by the mid-20th century, we established a state of Israel. And we were speaking Hebrew. And we have a sovereign state and a Jewish army and a Knesset was speaking Hebrew and a revival of Torah study in Israel in unprecedented numbers, and Jews, the largest Jewish community in the world, in the state of Israel, and our own flag right there. And that is shocking. That's a contradiction. That's the source of the current hatred of Israel, because the state of Israel, the return of the Jews to Israel, is frightening. It's the footsteps in the sand of a once extinct velociraptor. It's not fossilized, you don't have to worry about. It's not fossilized, it's alive and kicking. And that's a problem. If you look at some of the sources, I quoted here Augustine. He said, scattered across the globe, the Jews are the custodians of our books, like the slaves who carry their master's law books to court and then wait outside. James Parks, it is childish in the face of the absolute rejection to imagine that God will ever allow the Jews to rebuild their temple or return to Jerusalem. You know, it's interesting. In 1948, the Vatican was confronted with an ideological problem because they had Christian, the doctors of the Christian church, Augustine, Chrysostom and others, had said that the Jews could not return. Their exile will only be over when the Jews accept Jesus. So we got back to Israel in 1948, we didn't accept Jesus. So you know what they did? They actually modified their doctrine. They actually said, no, what they meant was the Jews won't get Jerusalem back until they accept Jesus. What happened in 1967? 1967, that's when the Vatican started calling for internationalizing Jerusalem. Not because they're worried about the holy places, because the only country in the Middle East that preserves Christian holy sites is Israel. They're not worried about the holy sites. What they're worried about is a contradiction to their theology. And if you have a look, Benjamin Blech, a fantastic article in Viewpoint, he says the return of the Jews to Israel from their decreed lands of dispersion will never take place unless Jews embrace Jesus. If a religion stakes a claim of credibility by affirming that an event cannot ever happen, and it does, it would appear that the damage is irreparable. And from the perspective of the Muslims, it's just as problematic. Why? Because who, according to them, are the true heirs of Abraham? The Muslims. Who are the true inheritors of the land of Israel? The Muslims. So how can it be that the Jews, who are they should be trivia, they should be a sideline of history, how can it be that the Jews now have a successful country in the land of Israel that's defeated them in 5 wars, that has the best and most successful economy in the entire region, that is the most advanced scientifically, technologically, medically, education-wise, politically in the entire region, and is populated by Jews who rejected Muhammad, who rejected the Quran? That's inconceivable. And if you're an atheist, it's also a problem. You know why it's a problem? Because it sounds like that the predictions that the prophets made about the Jews coming back to Israel and the ingathering of the exiles and the redemption, there's a kernel of truth there. It's a little frightening. The Talmud says that sometimes it says, the expression is very beautiful. It says, Mazle chazia, ihu lo chazia. Your soul can sometimes see something even though you consciously don't see it. So a Christian perhaps, or a Muslim, or an atheist might look at the state of Israel and you know what their soul is seeing? Their own. It's seeing the destruction of their own ideology. It's seeing the Jewish people back alive. It's seeing the Jewish people with all the signs of nationhood. It's seeing the Jewish people back in the land of Israel. It's seeing the Jewish people, inheritors of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. That's pretty shocking if you're one of those groups. And consequently, what do they have to do? If something annoys you, get rid of it. Boycott, divest, sanction, vote against it in the United Nations, claim they have no right to exist, claim they're oppressing someone else, claim they're really descendants from the Khazars and they're really not Jews and they should be on the banks of the Volga as opposed to the Jordan, or whatever the current anti-Semitic scree is. And that's what the problem. So you have to get rid of it. But you see, for us, if you look at the other sources I mentioned, when we see the flowering of the land of Israel, it's an amazing thing, folks. You know, when I think it was Rothschild who established the Carmel wineries. It was Rothschild. The Carmel wineries, when they produced their first batch of wine in Israel in the beginning of the 20th century, they sent crates of wine to Jewish dignitaries around the world. One of the heads of the Yeshiva of Volozhin, called the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, Bar Ilan University is named after his grandson. So when he got a crate of wine, he heard that a crate of wine was brought from Israel. That's the first wine produced in Israel by Jews in 2,000 years. He put on his Shabbat clothing to greet a crate of wine. And when one of his students gave him a bottle of wine produced at the Carmel wineries in the land of Israel, wasn't a state yet, they gave it to him, he looked at it and he started crying. He could barely hold the bottle because he was crying so hard. Because, as Rashi tells us, one of the sources I quoted here, one of the greatest signs of the redemption is the land of Israel flowering for its people Israel. It's an amazing and beautiful thing. Israel produces olive oil, just like it used to in the old days. And you know what we've started doing again? The colour blue, which is on the Israeli flag, right, is the colour mentioned in Tchelet. Right? Tchelet was a lost art for 2,000 years. The Romans prohibited us from making that type of blue. Jews lost it. But a couple of Jews, one's a neuroscientist at Bar Ilan, the other's a dentist in Jerusalem, and they learned Torah together, the Chevrusa, the two Aris. They did a lot of research, and they were not the only people, and they found that there's a Murex trunculus snail in the Mediterranean, which has got a little gland on the back, which you split open the gland and this yellow liquid comes out, and when it's exposed to sunlight, it becomes a permanent, beautiful blue dye. That is the dye that Jews used 2,000 years ago. We have genetic DNA evidence of that. Fascinating. So there's a lot of stuff coming back. Wine, olive oil, right? The fruits of the land of Israel, egozi bars, and mukupelet, and krembo, and all the biblical glorious fruits of the land of Israel that's blessed with, right? They're coming back. I mean, when I think of the fruits of Israel, like krembo is the first thing that comes to my mind. Anyone know what a krembo is? Yeah, it's a krembo. It's like really lousy quality cookie with really lousy artificial cream on it, with pathetic quality chocolate on it, which combined tastes unbelievable. Unbelievable. And there's many, and I know there's the methodologies of eating. Some people take all the chocolate off and then eat the cream. And then some people take the cookie and eat the cookie and then eat the cream. Some people eat it from top down. They actually, a newspaper in Israel did a survey on eating habits of the creme. How do you eat the krembo, right? I think top down won. Most people did top down. So okay, but that's fine. Whatever. I have no prejudice against people who do it the other way. Right? Perverse, but I don't care. Right. So, but that's an important point. Now, there's another point also. That we need reminders of who we are. The Jewish people need reminders. And some of our sages, I think you saw the Meshech Chochmah in the outline there, one of the great sages of Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, beginning of the 20th century, he said, sometimes Jews forget, and we start to believe what the anti-Semites say, that we're fossils, that the Torah doesn't obligate us, that it's been abrogated, it's been replaced by this, been replaced by that, it's been replaced by modernity. So, unfortunately, we need reminders. Sometimes the reminder can be subtle. Sometimes the reminder is much more severe. And as he put it in just a chilling piece, which he wrote in the beginning of the 20th century, the Israelite will forget his origin and consider himself a citizen. He will abandon the studies of his religion. He will learn languages that are not his own. He'll copy only the negative traits of the Gentiles and not their positive traits. He will think that Berlin is Jerusalem. Then will come a fiery and violent storm that will uproot him. He will know that he is indeed a stranger. His language is our holy tongue. The languages of the nations are a temporary disguise, and his true sources are his Jewish roots. So both the Jews and the non-Jews tend to forget. And unfortunately, one of the reminders is anti-Semitism. And also, one of the effects of the Jewish people's flowering can sometimes be this anti-Semitism. But you see, their perspective is their soul senses a destruction of their own worldview. Whether it's a Christian who sees what happened to replacement theology is being replaced, and the Muslim says, what happened? We were the bee's knees and the ant's pants. That's an Australian expression. It means we were awesome, right? So we were great. And Islamic civilization, by the way, was the height of civilization for hundreds and hundreds of years. Cordoba in Spain, under the Muslims, made cities in Europe look like slums, hovels. They had much more advanced technology, they had great philosophers, they had great mathematicians, they had great astronomers, they had great poets. The Arab language was famous for its amazing poetry. In fact, the whole genre of Jewish poetry, Yehuda Halevi and Moshe ibn Ezra and all the great, and these many great Jewish poets and Shmuel Hanagi, etc. All of them, one of the reasons they got into poetry was because they had to compete with these Arabs who were beautiful poems. It was a civilization that was amazing. Amazing. It ruled many areas and it was fantastic. What happened to it? What happened to it? Look at Islamic countries today in terms of literacy, scientific output, education, poverty, every single scale of quality of life. They are not doing well. That would be putting it very mildly. And they look back at their historical memory of their own civilization. They compare it to the Jews, the dhimmi, the people who are supposed to be second-class citizens paying tribute to the hands of the Muslims, and the Jews have this estate. It's not about how much area we have. If the state would be 2 square miles of Tel Aviv, they'd still have a problem with it. Why? Because there are Jews walking around with their head held high. We're not paying tribute to the Muslims. They're paying taxes to us. Well, actually, the Palestinian Authority hasn't paid taxes for about 20 years, but they're supposed to, right? So what's going on? It's a contradiction to their worldview. So from our perspective, we have to understand that the only way to continue this is by our understanding of who we are and understanding our destiny and understanding our job in this world, which is the Torah and which is the advancement of this beautiful Torah we have, monotheism, ethical monotheism, and the support of the Jewish people as a people, which is a very big task, and it involves our identification with our history. But if we sever ourselves from our history, we're playing into the hands of those who would seek to sever us from our history as well. Whether it's the replacement theology of the Christians, whether it is Nask of the Muslims, or whether it is the obsolescence of the atheists. In all cases, we cannot play into their hands. But the same thing that gives them fear and trembling when they see what's happening in Israel and they see the success should give us what? Tremendous hope. Tremendous hope and encouragement. Because what for them, when they hear the footsteps of the redemption, that's frightening. That's like hearing the T-Rex, right, coming at you. Right? When we hear the footsteps of the redemption, that's like hearing my grandfather's footsteps coming down the hall to give me a treat or something like that. It's a very different feeling. So the soul, what the soul feels, and I still to this day I have to admit, I'm a little sentimental, but when on the New Jersey, I know it's hard to get sentimental on the New Jersey Turnpike because it's really a life and death struggle with the homicidal maniacs who drive on the roads in the northeast United States, right? But nevertheless, when I drive past Newark Airport and I see the tail of an El Al jet with the Israeli flag on it, I feel something. I look at that and I just saw a miracle. I just saw a miracle. But I bet you there are drivers on the New Jersey Turnpike who when they see that, they see red. They see the destruction of their own ideology. They see the obsolescence of their ideology. They see a contradiction to their prophecies and their predictions. They see someone holding their head up high who should be a second-class citizen. So it's exactly the same thing that gives me hope, is it creates for them the fear. But it's predicated on one thing. The state of Israel's success and the project of the Jewish people's success requires two things. It requires the physical, but it also requires, as importantly, what? The spiritual. Something can't exist without the soul. Things can only exist, you've got body and soul. The soul of the Jewish people is represented in the Torah. And the body of the Jewish people is the physical. So of course we have to do what we need to do in terms of when we vote to think about the state of Israel, because there are, what, 300 million United States citizens approximately? 300 million? Of those 300 million, maybe 15 million are Jews. Out of those 15 million, so how many people of the 300 million voters in the United States give a hoot about the state of Israel? It's a small percentage. I don't have to apologise if that's one of the paramount thoughts that I have in my mind when I think about politics. I don't have to apologise for that, because there's not a heck of a lot of people who worry about it. Of the 15 million Jews, how many of them worry about it? There are 15 million Jews in the United States. I think a lot of them are much more worried about issues like gun control and issues abortion and issues of social security and minimum wage than Iran getting a nuclear weapon, which they've said they want to use to wipe Israel off the map. We have to think of these things, right? That's the physical side. That's the physical side. And we can never ignore the physical side of reality. But there's also the spiritual side. The spiritual side is what gives life to the limbs. The soul of the Jewish people is the Torah. The Torah that we are here studying. When we come to a synagogue and we pray, we're actually, the Maharal quotes the Gemara. The Gemara says, when the Jews gather together to pray and study in a synagogue, it's as though they've come out of the exile. We're no longer in the exile. We're right here, we're in Israeli territory in a sense. We're out of the exile because we've gathered together for a spiritual purpose, connecting back to the origins of the Jewish people in unbelievable ways. When I read a verse from the Torah, written 3,200 years ago, preserved in scrolls from the Dead Sea, right, from 2,200 years ago, preserved in scrolls which were the oldest we've found, 14th century Italy, scrolls written a couple of hundred years ago on parchment, right, in a synagogue built during the Civil War of the United States, and we're still quoting from that same Torah. That's amazing. When we read Rashi, Jew who lived in France, in Troyes, in the Champagne region of France, 1040 to 1105, a Jew who lived in a town where there were maybe 100 Jewish families, and really was probably the single most influential Jewish author of the past 1,000 years. And we're still reading his words, written in France at the beginning of his grandson, Rabbeinu Tam, was beaten almost to death by a crusader. Okay, Rashi living in France, like that's, and we're still reading his work. How many people are reading something written in France in 1040, 1050, right? And when we read the words of Maimonides, writing expelled from Spain by the Almohad Muslims, expelled from Morocco by the Almohads, expelled from Israel or having to leave Israel because of the Crusaders, finding a home in Cairo, writing in the 13th century, and we're still reading his words. We're still reading his words. And he wrote in Hebrew, his major work, the Mishnah Torah, he wrote in Hebrew because he said most of his stuff he wrote in Arabic because that's what most Jews spoke. But he understood that his book was being written for the future. And he said the one language we'll always have in common is Hebrew. If I write in Hebrew, it's safe. Jews anywhere, right? That's an amazing thing. So we look around at ourselves, gathered here in a shul, studying works written 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago, and so on and so forth, and it's still alive for us, and we still live with it. That is a living miracle. It's a living contradiction to all the predictions of our demise. We are living contradiction to the fossil theory of the Jewish people. We're living evidence of the redemption and the destiny of the Jewish people. So that's a little bit of the idea, some ideas of anti-Semitism. The rest is commentary, go and learn. So you're not getting off, right? You have to continue learning with CFR to get the rest of the story. Was that on 770 they used to have, and now for the rest of the story? Who was that? That's it, thank you. He was great, right? So I've just given you part of the story, but the rest of the story is written in there, and it's written on these books, And that's our obligation, is to study that and to be connected to that amazing, not history, right? It's not ancient history, right? It's rather a living, breathing entity, which is the Jewish people, which is not only alive and kicking, but thriving. And not only thriving, but growing. And not only growing, but heading towards the redemption that we should see speedily in our days. Amen. Happy to take questions, heckling, political endorsements, and insults.
When you said 15 million...
questions from rabbis I don't have to take. All right, fine. Yeah.
When you said 15 million, I heard a buzz in the back.
Oh, I don't know how much it is.
You meant, well, 5 million is in the census, but 15 million is a pretty good genetic number.
Right, that's correct.
And it's 330 million, but...
oh, sorry, okay. Right, so yeah, when we talk about numbers of the Jewish people, it depends who's doing the counting as to what the number is. Right, so it's sometimes problematic. In other words, there are organisations, the Reform movement considers patrilineal descent, which is in Jewish tradition, Jewish law and Jewish history, it's always been matrilineal descent, as psychologists say. We always look to the mother, right? So also in defining a Jew, it's the mother. So they may count, people who are not Jewish. According to, so yes, I understand that there are. I just threw out that number. I really didn't. Not familiar with the number. Yeah.
How do you reconcile the Christian view that we're fossils against their religion, but the 5,000 who you heard sing so beautifully and waving the Israeli flag? How do you reconcile?
So it's a good question. So the people in Kufi, the Christians United for Israel, do not believe. They believe that replacement theology is heresy. They do not believe they've replaced Judaism. They see themselves as a sister religion to Judaism. And indeed, the Catholic Church, recently the Pope had a pronouncement that was very similar to that, almost repudiating replacement theology on the part of the Catholics. Of course, obviously, the Methodists and the other groups that voted for BDS obviously do not accept that, but there are different, Christians are a very, very diverse group. And they have many, many different theological perspectives that are all called Christianity. But certainly there are significant amounts of Christians who don't believe in the replacement theology and actually see Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies. I remember I had dinner with Senator Sam Brownback, who, what state is he from? Kansas, like 3 Jews in Kansas. So he's not doing it for the votes. He's a major supporter of Israel. So I asked him, why do you support Israel so much? So he said, enlightened self-interest. I said, what do you mean? He said, because in Genesis, God told Abraham, I will bless those who bless you. He says, I believe that America's support for Israel and America's providing an environment in which the Jews can be Jews, he says, has given us blessings. He says, so I'm selfish. He says, I support Israel, the Jews, because, you know what? I want God's blessings. He says, sue me. He didn't actually say sue me. But he did actually say it's because of the blessing, enlightened self-interest. So that's like a different perspective. That's a very interesting perspective. Look, there are Christians who believe in something called the rapture. That there has to be a certain amount of Jews in Israel, and then they'll have this, I don't know how it works, like a third will go up to heaven, and a third will convert to Christianity, and a third will be involved in this war, and they'll all convert to, Jesus will come again, etc., etc. So, you and I know that's not going to happen, so in the meantime, their support is wonderful. But there are some Christians like Kufo, very sincere, and don't look at it either of those ways. Yeah, someone had a question? Yeah.
So when you think about the people who converted to Islam either by force or Christianity by force, they had to...
Jews. Yeah.
And then you think about their kids, and their kids who are probably most likely still Muslim to this day or Christian to this day. Like, how do we, reconcile is the right word with those people, and how do we, are they Jews or are they not Jews?
Well, first of all, the only way that they could still be Jews is if each one is descended from a Jewish mother. In other words, let's say in 711, or in the 8th century, 711 was the invasion of Spain. But in the 8th century, when the Muslims took over North Africa and many Jews converted to Islam. So the only way from then, that's 1,300 years ago, right, you'd have to have a continuous chain. Mother, she has a daughter, the daughter has a daughter, the daughter has a daughter, the daughter has a daughter. The chances, and that's the only way that their descendants could be Jewish. So the chances of that happening are extremely slim. Which means those people who converted at that point in history, their descendants are no longer Jews. There are many, many people in Brazil, in Spain, in Portugal, who are descendants of Jews who converted in those riots, 1391 and later on 1497. They're not Jews. They're descendants of Jews. They may have, as Rav Khan mentioned, some genes, Levi's, right, which is Jewish, of course, right, but and possibly Kohanim, but nevertheless, they're not Jews from a halachic perspective. Okay, and if they are, then it just makes the tragedy even worse. It's like one more thing to cry about on Tisha B'Av. And unfortunately, we know that there were anti-Semites in history who were Jews. One of the debate that Nachmanides had was with a Jew who had converted to Christianity. His name was Pablo Cristiani. Okay, and there are some who believe that Torquemada, the chief inquisitor, was an apostate Jew. Unfortunately, we have had Jews throughout history who have disappeared from the Jewish community and assimilated, and unfortunately they've become enemies. So it hurts, I think, even more when that happens. But I think probability-wise, it's very unlikely that a lot of these people are Jewish. I mean, you could have someone like Mary McCarthy. Anyone heard of Mary McCarthy, famous author? We have all her books at home. My wife likes it, right? So she's got a book called Memories of a Catholic Girlhood. Mary McCarthy was Jewish. Her grandmother was a Morgenstern. She married a Catholic, she became Catholic. She had a daughter. The daughter married a Catholic. She had a daughter, and that daughter is Mary McCarthy. So, so Mary McCarthy, halachically, was Jewish. On the other hand, you could have someone with a very Jewish-sounding name who eats at all the kosher-style delis in New York regularly, right, and is not Jewish. It's like halacha has its own criteria. Yes, I saw a hand back there. Yes.
To specify, if someone years ago, many generations ago, had converted but had already had a child, a daughter, that daughter is unless that daughter they converted, she is still Jewish.
Even the person who converted is still Jewish. Even the person themselves who converted is still Jewish. If a Jew, converts to Christianity, they're still 100% Jewish. 100% Jewish. They have to make a bracha when they have a drink. They have to sit in the sukkah on Sukkot. And it doesn't matter what religion they converted to, they are still 100% Jewish. Problem is, if that person marries a non-Jewish woman and has a child, that child is not Jewish. But the parent who converts is still 100% Jewish. You cannot, sorry to tell you folks, you can't leave. One way, right? Once you're Jewish, you're always Jewish. And there are many, and it's very interesting, if you look in responsa literature from medieval times, they talk about this extensively. We generally follow the view of Rashi, and this is the halacha, Rashi and the Rambam, which is that a Jew, even if that Jew is converted to another religion, remains 100% Jewish. Whether their children are Jewish, that depends who they marry and who the mother is.
We would not be mitzvah for them to a minion.
That's a different issue. That's because they don't believe in the same God. That's something to do with their Judaism. They're still Jewish, but they just don't believe in the same God. There was a famous case, the Brother Daniel case. Ever heard of Brother Daniel?
Yes.
There's a guy, a Jew in France, who'd become a monk of some Catholic order. And he decided he wanted to make Aliyah. He comes to the Aliyah Shaliach, the poor Israeli kid, right? He's 22 years old, just finished the army, he's in Paris. He says, this guy walks in as a monk, he says, I want to make Aliyah. The guy says, this is only for Jews, So the guy says, I'm Jewish. He says, no, and he shows him his parents' ketuvah and his birth certificate, 100% Jewish. This Israeli is way above his pay grade, you know what I mean? So this guy, Brother Daniel, actually sued in the Supreme Court in Israel for recognition of the fact that he was Jewish. Now, halachically speaking, he was Jewish. We may not be happy about him coming to Israel, right? It's not, but legally speaking, he's a Jew. So, yeah, other
but
question.
he can be prevented from
Two
doing
points,
certain
if I may.
things.
That's true. That's not a contradiction to what I said.
Responsible.
Yeah, go ahead.
With the difficulty of going totally against one's ideology by accepting the fact that Jews exist and are doing well. On a more personal basis, it's not just the big word ideology out there. It's denying what your parents have taught you, what your family has lived, what your heritage has stood for.
You mean Jews who are
No, I'm
themselves...
talking about Christians
Oh,
or non-Jews to start understanding the Jewish phenomenon and
you're right.
accepting the Jews. It's much more than an intellectual
you're right,
kind of
100%. There's a
contradiction.
lot of... Yes.
And there are people who have done that. There are people who have left their Nazi families and disowned them. There are now a few ex-jihadist Arabs from England that I read about who have also given up their families and fought for them. But it's an enormous thing to
You have
be
to give
able
up
to
2,000
do
years
that.
of cultural baggage. It's not a simple thing. Right.
It's so many pieces of your identity.
I don't think it excuses them, but you're 100% correct.
It's more than an intellectual argument.
No, 100%. It's a very good point. It's much more than an intellectual and ideological.
Or spiritual.
There's a lot of emotional, and there's also sometimes people pick it up just from their families.
Exactly.
Right? In other words, they hear things. You hear things like Jew used in certain ways from your parents and grandparents, or you might hear, right? So people hear that. It's very hard to give that
All
up.
prejudice is learned.
Right? Or if you learn it, you hear sermons in a church, and the sermon says certain things like that. It talks about the Jews killing Jesus and so on and so forth. Right? I don't know if anyone saw Mel Gibson's movie. It was a terrible movie. I mean, I saw it. I went in disguise. I wore a baseball cap, so no one knew I was Jewish. Anyway, so and it was not the Mets, so it was right. It was actually City of David, Jerusalem baseball cap. So anyway, a horrific movie. But if you grew up with that type of ideology espoused in the movie that the Jews are guilty, and that the crowd is yelling, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" etc. It's hard not to be an anti-Semite, right? And especially amongst the Arabs, when there's great reverence for the Quran and for the Hadith, and imams regularly espouse rabidly anti-Semitic doctrines. And by the way, the whole phenomenon of what they call lone wolf terrorism in Israel is rubbish. It's not lone wolves. These people are educated in the Palestinian Authority and in the mosques to hate Jews. They've been educated that way. It's not a lone wolf. There's a deliberate education that way, number one. Number two, the Palestinian Authority pays money to the families of people who are killed while carrying out acts of terrorism against Jews, which means the child knows their family's going to be financially better off. Number three, they glorify, name streets after these people, name a soccer team after these people. They glorify, which means the teenager knows that they'll be a hero, they'll be glorified. So to call them a lone wolf is, I think it's borderline anti-Semitism, because it's ignoring the reality in which the Palestinian Authority, and as you're pointing out, the education system and the heritage and the religion is all pouring out, spewing forth anti-Semitism on a regular basis. It's not as Ban Ki-moon, idiot, right, who talks about it as a natural human reaction to occupation. No, it's not. Right? And it's not as it's not spontaneous. It's been tutored. It's been encouraged by Palestinian Authority television. It's been encouraged by Hamas. It's been encouraged in the kindergartens. It's been encouraged in the schools, and it's being financially incentivized. I think is the term. I think that was made up not long ago. But incentivized by the Palestinian Authority. So they're not lone wolves, and it doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of a long heritage of hatred. Long heritage of hatred. Yes? Can
I write my second point? If you have any insight into the opposite phenomenon of anti-Semitism where there are no Jews, there was a book written in post-war Poland, Anti-Semitism with No Jews.
Because,
or in Shakespeare,
Well, because there's still a stereotype of Jews in the consciousness, and historical consciousness.
So if they've never met a Jew for
Absolutely.
centuries,
You don't need to. Don't
it's
need
still
to.
there.
Malaysia. I mean, Malaysia is an Islamic country, but there's rape. I mean, the government is rabidly anti-Semitic. I corresponded with a professor at University of Kuala Lumpur who told me that the only book about Judaism I have to stop now. The only book in the university about Judaism is a book written by a Russian anti-Semite at the beginning of the 19th century called The Talmud Revealed. One book in the university, Kuala Lumpur. Okay, I've got to stop now because I think we need to do Mariv, and I have to get my beauty sleep. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you around.
Thank you, Rabbi Becher. Thank you all for coming. We'll let you know about the next Yeshivalite, and we'll stay in touch.